Right, it's 10:31, so I think it's time for begin. Welcome everyone. We're very happy to have you all here. It is our pleasure to introduce the panelists and our moderator. Dr. Sarah Greca has a PhD from Queen's University in Kingston. She specializes in diplomacy, defense, and global alliances. This panel is being hosted as a part of CIC Winnipeg's Foreign Policy by Canadians project, which is designed to increase the citizen engagement and public education in the realm of foreign policy. As a result of this panel, it will be incorporated into the guide and the public education material produced by Professor Wesley Bork for deepening the public engagement in Canada with foreign policy. And without further ado, I think I will pass it on to Dr. Greco to begin the panel.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's panel, Resisting Aggression, Protecting Democracy. This morning, we have two exceptional panelists, Dr. Anessa Kimball. She is a professor of international relations at Universite Laval, where she is director of the Center for International Security at the Higher School of International Studies. She is also the co-director for security and the Canadian Defense and Security Network. Dr. Kimball is an expert on NATO, North American defense, and global strategy. She is also a member of the Defense and Security Foresight Group with the North American team. Professor Kimball will discuss the current state of defense and security cooperation and how Canada should engage its allies and participate in alliances in an era of increasing power rivalry. Our second panelist, Dr. Ho-Fung, is the Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Weinsfeld Professor in Political Economy in the Department of Sociology and the Paul H. Neitz School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. His interests include global political economy, protests, nation-state formation, social theory, and East Asian development. Professor Hung's presentation will focus on the current state of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong and China's efforts to suppress it from the perspective of Canadian foreign policy. Thank you both for serving on this panel. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and insights. I will turn the floor over right now to Dr. Kimball.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for this opportunity to spread a little bit of information and some of my ideas out in Western Canada. I'm very pleased to have been invited. And so, as was mentioned, I work primarily on institutions, cooperation, security design. NATO, NORAD are some of my areas of expertise. And so in this presentation, I'm going to talk broadly about NATO and North American defense. And so, of course, NORAD would be included there. Also, I will talk about if there are effects on NATO decision-making when it comes to the transitions that are coming in the future. And then talk a little bit about how NATO, China, and some of the, or NATO, Canada, and some of the key allies might think about engaging China in the next few years, just to give you an idea of where I'm going. And so as we might start out and think about Canada's contribution in NATO and Canada's contribution to North American defense and its role in North American defense. One of the things that is essential to note, of course, is the NORAD binational command is the only one that exists in the world. It is the only command in which two states sovereignly share authority over an airspace. The NORAD command itself has adapted significantly since 9/11. We would note that NORAD took on other types of tasks in order to make itself relevant in the 9/11 era. For example, maritime warning, terrestrial warning, and of course, aerospace. So we see here an institution in which the two partners have recognized the changing geostrategic circumstances and have adapted the institution. But on the other hand, when it comes to NORAD, we have also seen, particularly in Canada, because it goes under the radar, one might say, there has not been a lot of, and this is a good thing, there has not been a lot of emphasis, for example, on NORAD modernization. this is something that must happen in the next 5 to 10 years. Actually in the next 5 years, because the equipment is essentially its lifetime of service is done. And so if we do not change that, then this is a large risk. And this, of course, matters when we're talking about Russia and China. And so that's one thing that we need to think about, is the extent to which Canada itself has or has not undertaken the engagements it needs to do, particularly financial, to do the NORAD modernization. And some of this has to do with political will in Ottawa. And I think some of this also has to do with, in some senses, a willingness to not want to make NORAD political, which has been very important to its survival in some senses. If NORAD becomes political, then it can actually end up on the US kind of political radar, and that would never be a good thing for NORAD. And so when it comes to NATO, Canada and NATO in these last few years, one of the things we often think about Canada and NATO, there is the persistent belief that Canada does not actually play its role, or does not fulfill its role as it should in the organization. And so one of the things that we can do is we can actually look at what contribution and Canadian spending has looked like in NATO. And so what I have here, I've shared my screen, in which you see, this is from a publication of mine in 2019, which is available at Universite of Calgary. And so the question of whether or not Canada is sharing the burden as it should is very clear in this graphic. What I do here is I've compared 1999 to essentially the civil budgets in 2018 and 2019. And so it's very clear Canada has actually taken on 33% more burden in the organization. Turkey, notably, has also taken on a large number of burden. What is also notable is that the country that has benefited most from enlargement of the institution in the last 2 years is actually the UK. We see the UK has reduced its share the most, followed by Germany and the US. And these things are notable as NATO goes into its next round of budgeting for essentially the next quinquennial. And we know it's getting ready to put out its next strategic concept before the end of the year. And so at NATO right now, of course, there are discussions going on about what burden sharing will look like in the future. But a couple things are pretty clear here. One thing that remains clear is, of course, the United States shoulders most of the burden, as we know. Canada itself has remained sixth. It remains pretty steady in this spot. One of the things that would also be notable, but is not on this table, of the new allies that entered since the end of the Cold War, Poland has actually effectively tripled its contribution and is now 10th in NATO as a contributor. And this is fairly significant for a new country, considering the alliance's age. And so one thing we can think about when we look at NATO is that, yes, Canada is contributing. Other ways we know Canada is contributing is, for example, through Operation Reassurance, where Canada has a brigade that's stationed in Lithuania. In Latvia. What is important about this activity in particular is that Canada is the only country that is not in the top 5 that is leading a brigade. Canada is also the country that is leading the brigade that has the most partners in the most spoken languages. And so what we could say is that, one of the things that Canada has a kind of a comparative advantage in is basically managing multilingualism in military operations. And this has become one of the things that NATO has essentially shifted onto Canada very subtly in the last few years. And Canada hasn't really complained about it, because Canada is always ready to contribute. But it should be noted that all of the other allies that manage missions basically will manage missions unilingual or maybe bilingual. There's almost no allies that are managing as many languages as Canada is in a terrain and doing what it does. And so again, this question of whether or not Canada contributes, we might consider it purely a financial question, but on an operational leadership practical level, I think it's very clear Canada is going beyond what we might expect it to be doing in the institution. In considering the future of the institution, I already noted the importance of Turkey. Turkey itself, I mean, we could probably do a whole talk on Turkey, what's going on there. It is notable of NATO countries, Turkey is probably one that is slipping further and further away from cohesion with NATO. And so this would be a country where Canada should start to engage as much as it can right now to try to essentially bring Turkey back into what is the NATO fold. And another thing to know is that there will be effects of Brexit on NATO. It is kind of somewhat ridiculous to believe that Germany and France will not try to punish or will not try to have the UK shoulder more burden in the next several years, precisely because of Brexit and precisely because they may move ahead with defense in Brexit. And this may also put other allies that are partners in both institutions into a bit of a corner, especially those that rely on the United States, like the new NATO allies. Will they choose the stability and certainty over a NATO alliance with an uncertain US credibility, or would they move closer to the European orbit, essentially based on this idea that they should hedge their bets? And particularly when they have not very many military resources, this will be a hard decision. And we know NATO will not be wanting states to double hat soldiers, for example, and so have them be allocated to 2 missions at once. And so this should be important to think about. When it comes to thinking about how states have shifted in power, what I did here is, you will see in the next slide, I have compared the Global Firepower Index from 2016 to the Global Firepower Index of 2020. And so several things are notable. In the last 4 years, what you see is all of the countries that are in green have shifted up at least 2 positions in the last 4 years. All of the countries that are in red have shifted down at least 2 positions in the last 2 positions or more in the last 2 years. And what we should be looking at, of course, the green countries mean these are the countries that Canada should be seeking more and more engagement with, because these are the countries that are emerging more and more on the scene. And Canada should also be thinking about the red countries, in the sense that these are the countries that may be experiencing defense difficulties and may actually be looking to Canada and find some sort of support in Canada, particularly Poland, particularly the UK. For better or worse, Canada has historic ties to the UK, and it could find itself a little bit torn in the UK, French, German debate over European security futures. And so Canada needs to be more savvy to this role than it has been. And finally, I would note on this list that, of course, the United States, Russia, China, and India remain unchanged in ranking. What is important when you look at the data for those states particularly is that they have all gotten increasingly powerful. And so what we are seeing now, and so for instance, Canada slipped in ranking, but Canada slipped only because other states grew their power more than Canada grew its power. It grew its power, but it actually slipped in ranking. And so this is also something that I think Canada needs to be a little more attentive to, is that while it remains a powerful state, it's still in the top 25. It's literally hanging on the edge of the top 25. 4 years ago, it was 22. And so again, I think that speaks to certain logics and certain things Canada needs to think about in its future. In closing, I would go over to the question of Canada's relations with China. We know its relations with China have been difficult. There are multiple files or issues in which China and Canada have to cooperate. There are other issues, files in which there are certain frictions. One of the things that we know Canadians talk about a lot in terms of public opinion is supporting democracy, is supporting these very ideals that are the foundation of Canada. But the irony is, according to a recent survey done by Nanos and the Canadian Defense and Security Network, is even though Canadians want Canada to care about those things when it comes to intervening or actually deploying military force, they care more about economic national interests than about those ideals that they tend to put up front. And so again, at the end of the day, Canada tends to be very pragmatic. And I think with China, in some levels, it has been following this pragmatism. For example, maintaining, a place in the Trans-Pacific Partnership after the withdrawal of the United States, because this provided an extra environment, an extra forum for Canada to find itself linked to China. And so I think Canada has been doing some of the right things. Where Canada has been doing some of the wrong things, I think, are mixed messages about specific files, particularly the file concerning the detainees, Canadian citizens that have been in China for a long time detained. And finally, I think that Canada needs to care a lot more about cyber when it comes to China. And that China and Russia remain kind of the two largest sources of cyber attacks. And Canada needs to take this. I know that in NORAD and in NATO, Canada is taking this extremely seriously. But I think that what I see, at least, is that there's a lot of decentralization in how we treat cyber. And I think that that could be a challenge in the effectiveness of how Canada might design a grand strategy about cyber defense. And with that, I thank you for spending several minutes to me, and I pass it over to my colleague, Dr. Hung.
Hi, thank you, Professor Kimball, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel and share my thoughts. And I'm going to talk about literally the democratic movement of Hong Kong, but more about the Beijing response to the democratic movement in Hong Kong. As you know, that is national security law, and particularly the global implications of the national security law. And what I want to emphasize is that this recent development in Hong Kong is definitely about human rights and about the prospect of democracy in Hong Kong, but it has a wider significance to the international system in terms of international security, and even in terms of the business environment in China and the Greater China region, that people, even though you might not be interested in politics and democratization, but if from a perspective of international security and business interests, that Canadians and people in North America and around the world need to pay attention to. To summarize the development briefly, as you know, that is widely reported about this national security law that the Beijing make and impose on Hong Kong, that deemed a lot of activities, including weakly divided, promoting subversion to the Chinese state and promoting separatism and collusion with foreign forces illegal, not only illegal by action, but also illegal by advocacy and speech. Some people interpret this development as very contingent response on the part of the Chinese government to the protests against the extradition law in Hong Kong in 2019. And some people attribute the national security law to the style of Xi Jinping. But my point is that it is much bigger and deeper than that, because it is not only a kind of done through a kind of ad hoc decision by Xi Jinping, and it is actually many people who have been observing the development of Hong Kong have been seeing it coming for a long time. And I would say that it is even what the Chinese government has been intended for as an end game for Hong Kong when it signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984, because in the early 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping talked about one country, two systems, the British, for example, there's an occasion when the British the foreign ministers visit Beijing in 1980, 1981 and asked Deng Xiaoping about one country, two system. Deng Xiaoping said that actually one country, two system is not new. We have tried it before, a lot in the name of one country, two system, but that is in Tibet in 1951 to 1959, when the Chinese Communist Party signed an agreement with the Dalai Lama government to allow the Dalai Lama government to exercise autonomy, self-governance, and Beijing just take care of foreign policies and defense. And of course, and we all know how it ended in 1959 with the conflicts and the freeing of Dalai Lama, and then the shift from one country to system to one country to one system in Tibet. So that, and you look at the Chinese textbook about one country, two system, or Chinese governance of frontier regions, that they always put Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau issues side by side with Tibet, Xinjiang, and all these minority area, and always mention that this kind of a first experiment of one country, two system was in Tibet in 1950s, and it ended badly. Of course, the Beijing won't blame themselves for that failure, but blame the Dalai Lama for that. So, and some legal experts even look at the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law that protect Hong Kong's one country, two system and autonomy after 1997, and look at the terms that they use, look at the phrases that they use, and actually a lot of them are borrowed from the 17-point agreement that Beijing signed with the Dalai Lama government in 1951. So it has been always in the playbook that the one country, two system, and this, even though the Sino-British Joint Declaration is regarded as a treaty, it is registered in the United Nations. From a China standpoint, that this kind of international treaty is they have a very dialectical rather than a rule of law conception of this international agreement and treaty, that it is signed as a kind of a tactical move to buy times when Beijing cannot fully establish control of the territory, and after the time has come that Beijing is fully confident to establish full control, that they can scrap the law and scrap the treaty and agreement at will, and there's nothing that other peoples and other countries and signees of the agreement can do. So it happened in Tibet in 1959. Now it's happening in Hong Kong. So the international implication is that that why people caught very surprised and actually outraged by it, not only because of the attack on the freedom of speech and all this freedom in Hong Kong, but also it reflects the Chinese conception of treaty and agreement. And we slowly and actually it's finally see that it is not only regarding this political agreement like the Sino-British Joint Agreement, British Joint Declaration, but also that when China, for example, get admitted into WTO, it pledged about opening of market, opening of financial sectors, a lot of commitment that China pledged that it would do when it get admitted to WTO. But now the many other countries, of course, and including US and EU, and many countries are complaining that China is not honoring a lot of these commitments that it made when it admitted WTO. So it is a kind of a very Chinese field of agreement on international treaty and participation in international bodies and organizations. And of course, that China is not the only one that historically didn't abide by all these rules and commitment. There's a lot of powerful countries in the world, from UK to US, and have this kind of a bad history of not abiding by the rule and law. But in all these democratic countries that there's free election, there's monitoring of the press, and then so there's a possibility of changing of policy and pressure. But in terms of China, which is an authoritarian regime, there's low process or mechanism besides raw international balance of power and geopolitical power that can possibly hold China accountable to the commitment and the pledge that it made. So this national security law is a kind of a representation of this Chinese conception of international agreement and commitment. And more troubling is that the national security law is not only put activists and democratic advocates at risk in Hong Kong, but also people who do business in Hong Kong. It is why a lot of the foreign chamber of commerce and business communities are worried and start to diversify their operation from Hong Kong, because as you know that this the national security, state secret, and all this regulation in how it was exercised in mainland China show that they, in the end, will not only be used against dissidents, but also against business people who might have some business dispute with the local authorities, with business partners, and well-connected state-owned enterprise. For example, we see a lot of these kinds of cases. They charge the representative of foreign companies, or you put them in jail and in detention by citing violating national security and devotion of disclosure of state secret and such and such. So in a kind of a offshore financial market situation in Hong Kong, that a lot of state-owned enterprise traded in Hong Kong Stock Exchange, a lot of international investors involved in all this business deal. So people will wonder if, for example, a financial press talking about the kind of a fraudulence and corruption of a state-owned enterprise traded in Hong Kong stock market, whether it will constitute a kind of a subversion to the national security of China, and also disclosure of state secret. And also another part of the national security law is that it makes collusion with foreign forces against China's national interests as also illegal under the national security law, and it make many people very nervous, because in international city like Hong Kong, a lot of definitely there's a lot of foreign citizens there. There's a lot of Canadians, a lot of American, Australians, and also a lot of representatives of business from around the world who are making connections and having socializing events and exchanging information and such. And under these clauses in the national security law about collusion with foreign forces, then people will be concerned whether this kind of international connections and information sharing will become a problem in the long run. And at the same time, in the national security law, there is a clause that is very troubling. That is the Article 38 of the National Security Law, which is even more draconian than the comparable national security law in mainland China, because the Article 38 of the law say that any persons, Chinese or non-Chinese citizens who commit crime deemed criminal according to the national security law inside or outside Chinese territory will be subject to the law, meaning that it is a kind of a vast expansion of the jurisdiction of the law globally, actually, to Chinese or non-Chinese citizens alike, meaning so it invokes some nervousness about, for example, somebody, American, Canadians, Australians, or Japanese, who say something or do something this is deemed violating Chinese national security in the foreign countries other than China, like in Canada or in Australia. So it already happened. There's American citizens who's doing lobbying things in the U.S. Congress in D.C. is put on a kind of wanted list under the national security law. So of course that they cannot go out and arrest these people in foreign lands, but people will be very concerned if they are in transition in Hong Kong airport or in some kind of places like Thailand who has extradition arrangement with China or with Hong Kong, that they will be at risk of being arrested. So it is kind of a global reach of this national security law that is a problem. And the last thing that I would like to talk about is this the end of one country, two system with the imposition of the national security law, besides all these kind of implications for people who do business in Hong Kong, have business dealing in Hong Kong, also has a kind of implication to international security, because one of the deal when China took back Hong Kong from the British in 1997 is that Beijing warrant autonomy and the rule of law and freedom of information and such in Hong Kong in exchange for international recognition of Hong Kong as a separate entity from mainland China in all kinds of issues, from trade, investment to immigration. U.S. has an explicit law, and many countries have an explicit law to treat Hong Kong separately from mainland China. In terms of trade, investment, and immigration. For example, there is a kind of export control in many countries in the US and in Canada too, that to stop export of sensitive and potentially military used technology to mainland China, but Hong Kong is always exempt from it, even after 1997. So a lot of this kind of high tech and high speed computer, including actually the video game console, actually that cannot be exported freely to China, but can be exported freely to Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has been very important hubs for mainland China to get a hold of this technology. So it is why Huawei and all these high-tech companies are located in Shenzhen with a lot of labs established in Hong Kong and subsidiaries established in Hong Kong, because there's a lot of equipment that they cannot simply import it for the development of their products and a lot of other purpose. So they have to import it into Hong Kong. And now with the end of the one country, two system in Hong Kong and US and actually Canada also started to rethink about whether to treat Hong Kong separately in this kind of export of sensitive technology. And Canada already decided in the summer, I think this summer, that it stopped exporting sensitive technology and military use technology to Hong Kong. And as you know, that it is not only about China getting hold of this technology, but also about China's friend in the international system like Iran, that Huawei's got into trouble exactly because that Huawei is using its subsidiary in Hong Kong to import high-tech equipment from the US and transcript it to Iran to help Iran escape from the international sanctions. So Hong Kong has been used this way, and the deal is that if so far as Hong Kong remain autonomous, the international community will allow China to have this kind of backdoor or gateway to escape from this kind of international system of sanctions. But now that the deal has been broken on the part of China, then the question is whether the international community should increase its efforts to treat Hong Kong the same as mainland China in this export issue. Also investment from mainland China, particular state company, will receive national security scrutiny in Australia, in Canada, in US, but investment from Hong Kong will receive less of this kind of scrutiny. So historically, in the last 20 years after Hong Kong reverted to China, that a lot of Chinese investment is put on the cover of Hong Kong investment to go to Australia, US, Canada, so that they receive less security scrutiny. Now that Hong Kong and China is becoming more integrated politically and the autonomy has lost, and so that a lot of countries in democracy really need to rethink about its policy of whether to continue treating investment from Hong Kong is totally separate from the investment from mainland China, whether these countries, including Canada, need to increase the security scrutiny of investment coming from Hong Kong. So this national security law is a game changer. It is not a surprise. It has been written on the book that how autonomy of Hong Kong will end from the beginning, but it ends this way and ended now that it is forcing us, everybody in the free country, to rethink about all this implication to the global system, to the international security in light of our policy toward Hong Kong and toward China. So let me end here, and then I look forward to the questions and discussion afterward. Thank you.
Thank you both for your presentations. I've accumulated some questions from the chat and Q&A. If any participants have any additional questions, please feel free to leave them in either the chat or the Q&A section. The first question I'd like to pose, which is from Wesley, it's directed to Dr. Kimball. He writes, NORAD modernization will presumably involve a shift from ground-based radar to space-based surveillance. Is this how you see it? How do you see the Canadian Foundation for this?
I think one of the challenges when it comes to Canada and the transitions within NORAD and modernization is that, of course, we know Canada has a historic non-militarization policy of space. And so it's going to be more about trying to package this necessary thing in a way that makes it palatable to the Canadian public, that may see this as something that goes against kind of historical Canadian beliefs than something that is a strategic need of today. And so I think that that's something, you know, that's a public relations issue that I don't know how Canada gets around in some senses. You know, that's an informational issue that they, you know, and you can see this opinion very clearly when you talk to people. So, I mean, I think that that's just something that they have to do the groundwork to change. You know, and I think the other aspect is going to be about the, you know, the financial aspect. You know, is Canada ready to make the defense investment that it needs to make? You know, we saw Trudeau put forth a very ambitious defense investment plan with strong, secure, and engaged. But it remains to be seen if, you know, other governments will be following that plan. You know, unlike, you know, in China, where they can plan for 50 years on military spending, you know, and plan for long cycles, you know, Canada, we see, you know, there's almost an allergy to long-term planning when it comes to defense, you know? And so I think there's also, we need to get over that as well.
Thank you. The next question I'll pose is to Dr. Hung. Huawei claims it is not or will not be subject to Chinese espionage laws. Could you provide any views that you have on this?
Yes, thanks for the question. That actually, I'm puzzled by why Huawei said that it is not subject to Chinese espionage law. That because China in 2017 it has a national intelligence law, in which actually I'm looking at the exact wording here, but the China National Intelligence Law that passed in 2017 is that actually that all citizens and entities of China has everyone is I'm actually reading the English translation of the official text of the law is that everyone is responsible for state security. Which means that every citizens and entities, and when they are called for by the government to surrender some information that of importance to national security, that they have to, according to the law. So it is in Chinese law that actually companies and individuals and any entities and citizens in China that have the responsibility to provide information and intelligence. And then I'm not sure whether why the Huawei can claim that they can be exempt from that, even that they have been on the book and adding a clause saying that Huawei is exempted. And there's always a lot of loopholes, and China is not exactly a rule of law country, that it is always at the whim of the party to determine how the law is enforced and so on and so forth. If Huawei is not obliged to provide the information, my question is whether individual employees of Huawei as Chinese citizens will be obliged to provide those information. So this kind of I think it is a language game and also a rhetoric that to assure people that Huawei is not subject to it, and that I don't think a lot of people will really believe in the words of Huawei that it is exempt from the law.
Thank you. I'm going to offer up a question from Alex, and this is posed to both of you. I'll just read off the question. With the center of global power moving eastward, it would seem that strengthening our partnership with allies and like-minded democracies in the Asia-Pacific would substantially enhance Canada's future security. Can the panelists speak to how Canada is partnering on joint security issues with its friends in the Asia-Pacific?
Yep. Maybe I start first. That actually is a very interesting question, and also as Professor Kimball also mentioned that we need to be when we talk about this the ideal and security issue, we also need to be pragmatic, and so I agree that from a business and national interest point of view, there's no way that Canada, US, and any country can totally decouple from Chinese economy. It is a big market. It is important supply chain networks that you cannot go to anywhere else to do business. But at the same time, that we really, when we are engaging with China inevitably in terms of business and economic, we also need to defend our security and also economic interests. One example would be Korea, because in recent years, that Korea has increasing interaction in terms of investment and trade with mainland China. But at the same time, that it get burned with this kind of a fast missile system controversy. That China is very good at weaponizing its economic relation with other countries. So when South Korea, I think it is very reasonable for South Korea to allow the THAAD missile, anti-missile system to be installed in their country, because there's a real threat from North Korea that they are still testing missile and nuclear missiles. So it is very reasonable and justifiable for South Korea to install this system. But China is not happy about it, because the radar system of the THAAD system can reach a lot east of China, and China think that it is South Korea colluding with the US, jeopardizing Chinese security. And in the end, and many companies in South Korea, even orchestra and this kind of a youth group are being boycotted by China. That a lot of, for example, South Korean civil organizations, business are being boycotted in China, and China seems to be penalizing South Korea for defending their own security against North Korea threat. So it is a big problem that you can't avoid doing business with China. But at the same time, you need to build up a defense to make sure that China would not do this kind of thing too often or too aggressively, to penalize you for something that they are not happy about you in terms of geopolitics and security, that you really have to do it. The way to do it is that no countries can do it alone. So it is very important, as the friends who raised the question talk about, is that we need to build an alliance of like-minded countries with democracies and common sense of international security, so that we can support each other. So when China push back on this kind of thing that it make China unhappy and penalize a certain country like South Korea, that South Korea can count on other allies and to push back and make sure that China will pay a price for this, so that we will think twice next time when they do this kind of thing. And of course, that this kind of alliance building is very important. And unfortunately, in the last 4 years, the U.S. is not doing a very good job in that. So I hope that in the next 4 years that U.S. will be doing more and being more constructive in engaging with U.S. laborers in the North and South, and also in the Asia Pacific, to build an alliance of like-minded democracies to make sure that everybody can enjoy the benefits of mutual benefits of doing business with China, but at the same time defending ourselves against these potential drawbacks and problems.
I would add that, of course, the situation of South Korea is an interesting, special strategic situation. Over the last 4 years, what we have seen, particularly out of the United States, is a lot of trying to shift responsibility and the burden of the security towards partners away from the United States. Notably, the United States has the fewest troops in South Korea that it's ever had since the end of the Korean War. And, probably if Koreans take this as a sign of the credibility of the U.S. commitment, they're right to worry when the U.S. basically says, pay more to secure yourself and we're going to be less present. One of the reasons why Americans were, stationed in Korea was just to provide this tripwire so that things did not actually get out of hand or go too far. And so this, changes the strategic risk game from North Korea's perspective. The fewer and fewer Americans that there are essentially on the peninsula, and the more that they develop their capacity. And so South Korea is really left in this situation where it's trying to cover itself and being put under the economic press more and more to do so. And I think, Japan is trying to play the game a little bit differently. Japan has been a little bit more hedging in its behavior. It's trying to respectfully create a security space for itself where it doesn't manage to trip and annoy China. This is increasingly difficult as China sees its space of influence larger and larger in Asia. And this is definitely due to years and years of neglect by the United States, by Canada. Clearly, when you look at defense and security investment, all of the investment has gone towards Europe. We have very, very much neglected the eastern, portion. And right now, essentially we are, these are the results of the instabilities today and uncertainties today are the result of lack of investments for years and years. I was in Ottawa in 2016 saying, we need to care more and invest more in South Korea and in India and in Poland if we care about Canadian defense and security and international stability. And people were nodding heads, but then looking at me like I was crazy because these are not places we normally invest in. But that's one of the things that Canada needs to think about, that, Dr. Hung was talking about how South Korea is economically suffering because China tends to be penalizing it. This is places where other like-minded states can come in and say, we will invest here, we are like you, we are a democracy, we want to support liberalism and open environments. And what I see now is that there's a lot of discourse about creating things, but there's very little commitment to creating agreements and mandates and structures that do things. And so again, we can construct these, I call them constructivist talk spaces, right? Where we discuss issues, we have openness and all of that. Those things are great. But at the end of the day, there are very real security issues, and simply talking around a table is not going to solve those insecurities. And so, yeah, I think it's great, all of the like-minded stuff. But what I see very much about this like-minded stuff is it tends to be very at a superficial level, because there's so much diversity among the like-mindeds that we cannot create, that they cannot come to a firm, narrow mandate on anything. And so that's why I think that at the end of the day, Canada, even though it should be doing all of the like-minded stuff, it needs to also just start striking out on its own and doing bilateral things. And Canada hasn't had a hesitancy to do that. And this is a place where I think it just needs to, you know, step into the space and start doing it.
And perhaps either or both of you can speak to how we can move these ideas beyond simply ideas and kind of translate them a little bit more concretely. I'm not sure if either of you would like to expand on that a little bit more.
Well, of course, I mean, part of the issue when you're working as an intellectual and you're trying to influence policy, trying to influence change, you know, some of it is convincing the right stakeholders. Some of it is getting the right, you know, getting to the right people, to the right listeners, you know. And I think one thing that is good right now in Canada is that at least when we talk about defense, there seems to be a lot of openness to listening and trying to figure out what Canada's future should be. I feel a little bit less the same openness in foreign affairs. And of course, one of the issues we know traditionally for Canada when it comes to security and defense is that there are these two large silos, and that in foreign affairs, there is a philosophical silo that does not believe in defense diplomacy, or does not think that there's a value to defense diplomacy, because they see defense as this purely kinetic, negative, destructive thing. And I cannot, you know, I cannot underline enough, as one of the people who is an expert on Canadian defense and security cooperation, this is not at all very much of what Canada does in its defense diplomacy. I mean, Canada does more, you know, like what Canada is doing in the Ukraine with civil military training. That's exactly the type of stuff that defense diplomacy is, that Canada should be making kind of its trademark. These are ways that Canada can go. And I mean, civ mil training of police forces is one of the things that is at the heart of democracy, that is at the heart of kind of this monopoly of power in society, separating out the military from the civilian police forces. I think Canada has a very unique perspective on this, especially because its military actually intervenes in civilian crises and in disasters regularly. I mean, one of the things that's normal is that when Canadians see Canadian forces in the streets, they're not afraid. If you go to other countries and you see the national military in the streets, you know bad things are happening in most circumstances. And I think that this is something where Canada can, you know, really be making, you know, large influences without necessarily having the big, you know, it doesn't need a United Nations Security Council seat to do that stuff and have large effects, you know. In some senses, I think that the focus on a very public type of legitimacy for Canada's role has taken away from concentrating on what the actions that it can do to have a role. And I think what we saw in Afghanistan and how Canada's role in NATO, its respect in NATO, transitioned largely after Afghanistan is one of the ways in which Canada has very subtly built itself as a leader. And so, you know, what I see is that there's, you know, a lack of observation of how this could be exploited, rather than you know, an absence of will or anything like that. I just think that, you know, people aren't thinking, you know, aren't looking to the right toolboxes that we have, because, you know, like I say, we have an allergy or something to using defense. You know, it's something that's ingrained in Canada, even though, like, you know, I try very much to help people get out of it myself, because this is not good for national security. This is not good for national defense, even though it feels very good for Canadians.
Yeah, but I agree very much, and Canada has a huge stake in the prosperity and stability of the Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, and to keep and help keep this prosperity and security. Really intellectual engagement, multilateral agreement, and organizations and defense is very important. If things get worse in the Korean Peninsula, in the East China Sea, South China Sea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, that Canada cannot be exonerated from the chaos and the troubles that come up. So it is better to do things that preventively to prevent situation get worse. And so it is why that the election security law in Hong Kong and what is happening there is really important. And once the election security law is passed, there's a New York Times article that I agree very much. It's saying that it is the Hainan moment of China's expansion. Hainan, is referring to the 1930s in Germany. Mm-hmm. There's a piece of land after the First World War. German agreed to demilitarize and international monitoring and neutral than in the Hainan region. But then German remilitarized, sending German troops in there. And then in the beginning, that all UK and France and are very peaceful minded. They don't want to have war, and then they don't want to confront Germany on that. So, but in the end, the Germans get it as a signal that they can do it with impunity. And then the next is Czechoslovakia and Austria, and then Poland. And in the end, that war is broke out, and everything. Or the rest is history. So in which respect that if the international community at that time pushed back in the beginning to exact more price on Germany doing it, and then it will change the calculation and prevent further confrontation and even maybe able to prevent war. And definitely the same in China, that I don't think that China's regime is monolithic. There are different factions, that there's some faction want to be more cooperative with the international community, and then there are faction which is more nationalistic. And by the way, that is the nationalistic faction in China is very scary, because if you look at the intellectual current in China, that all these official scholars, they are talking about the legal philosophy of Carl Schmitt. So there's a kind of a very popular Carl Schmitt as a legal theorist in China right now. All his work is translated, as you know, that Carl Schmitt is the anti-Semitic Nazi legal theories who provide the foundation of German expansionism and in the Third Reich. So there's a tendency among certain factions in China that go into that direction, that they explicitly, some of them talk about after they deal with Hong Kong, the next will be Taiwan, South China Sea, and further out. If international community did not join hand to push back on this, that it will easily spill over to other international crises, that to the point that a larger confrontation and conflict will not be avoided. And I'm using this opportunity to respond some of the questions also in the chat box. That is the issues of dealing with China investment, and also that the larger issues of China expansionism and geopolitics is that you look at the bookseller kidnapping case is, again, not only about Hong Kong, but have an international implication, because two of the booksellers that was kidnapped and arrested and detained in China, one is British, one is British nationals. So they are not even Chinese citizens, but they're just ethnically Chinese. And then, but the Beijing government take on it is so a troubling sign that they treat Chinese diaspora in Western country as subject to their law and jurisdiction, and they treat it as a citizens. And one of the Chinese, and Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, even say that one of the kidnapped bookseller, even though he's British national, saying that he is first and foremost a Chinese. So it is kind of thing that happened to Russia, to ethnic Russians in all other places in the periphery of the Russian relation, that they start to treat this Chinese diaspora and overseas ethnic group as subject to the laws and national interests. So as we know that in North America, in Canada, in many other places, there's a lot of ethnic Chinese. So it will be they're Canadians, but they're ethnic Chinese. So that if the Beijing has this view about this ethnic Chinese also fall under the jurisprudence of Chinese law, and they are the subjects, and it will be a problem. And then they might also expand their networks of espionage and influence campaign through these ethnic groups, that we need to walk a fine line between not targeting certain groups and at the same time protecting this group. and at the same time being aware that the Chinese state has been weaponizing diaspora. Like it is Russia has been doing it, Turkey under Erdogan is also doing it, and it is something that democracies need to deal with in the long run, and we need to be very careful and find a way to deal with it without falling into the trap of racism, but at the same time to defending our national security and democracy.
And to kind of follow up with that and the discussion about Canada having a huge stake in the Asia Pacific, one of the questions was that was posed was about how Canada can more targetedly respond to China's soft power imperialism. I'm wondering if either or both of you could speak to that. It seems like the theme has been that Canada has kind of taken a little bit more of a backseat role and allowed for other countries to take the reins and for Canada to kind of follow suit accordingly. So how can Canada be a leader in this realm?
Yeah, briefly speaking, that I think that Canada can learn from what happened in Australia and New Zealand, and of course in Canada and New Zealand, Australia, they are all part of the Five Eyes, and UK, and the China strategy has been the US is difficult to crack, but that is Mao strategy to pick the weakest links in the enemy camps to break. So they pick Australia and New Zealand and have a lot of the kind of agents of influence and a lot of things that it is in the news that I don't need to repeat here. But now finally that Australia and New Zealand has been pushing back. Some people think that it's too late, but I don't think it is too late. That so far as they are aware of the risks and then try to work with the Chinese community and the business community to try to build up the defense against this expansion of soft power. That I think that they have been starting to do it and then doing quite a decent jobs in stopping it from spreading. I think Canada can definitely learn from their experiences.
I would say, I would point out Australia in particular in this context. Its new defense white paper is one of the first that I've seen in which a state puts forth strategic autonomy, basically exploring this idea that in a crisis our most counted on partners might not be there. So how might we manage, a security crisis if we are alone? And I think Canada has never seriously thought about it that way. Because of, sharing a large territory, a large continent with the United States, because of relations with the United States. I think that, and also because, I think that there's kind of a real, unwillingness to want to think anything could go that far. Canadians simply think they're not targetable because Canada's aren't colonizers. They don't start wars, right? And so why would anybody want to target Canada, right? And like I tried to explain, it's not that Canada is going to be targeted. It's that you're literally on the way to the United States, which is the target for most of the bad, players in the world right now. And you can't change your geography. And if you're not in ballistic missile defense, you're not going to be the person that's pushing the button to destroy the missile. And if you think they're going to destroy the missile over the United States and not over the Canada's north, again, I would like to sell you some swampland in Florida. It's very good for building, And so I think that there's a lot of this, a little bit of naivete we have to get over. And I don't want to think about those scenarios, but, in a very strict institutional context, and I've been to NORAD headquarters, Canada is watching the missile coming, but when it comes to hitting the defense button, they are closed out of the room. And they should care about this very much, especially as, missile defense expands in places like Iran and in South Korea and stuff like that. I mean, Canada right now, it's not in very many arcs, but that doesn't mean that Canadian interests are not at stake. That doesn't mean that Canadian partners are not at stake. And so it doesn't mean that it can do a little bit of the ostrich and kind of put its head in the sand and say, let's do all of the trade, but let's not do the difficult issues. And so I think that's also, a little bit where, Canada has to, take a little more responsibility on some of these issues that they know are going to be friction issues, and figure out, exactly where the boundaries of negotiation are. I feel a lot like on economic issues, Canada is constantly being pushed back into its, against its comfort zone in some senses. And, it's part of the asymmetry. It's part of so when it comes to, the next several years, I think that there are both strategic things that Canada needs to think about with partners. There are, technical things. My colleague mentioned a lot, the whole dual use technology, the militarization of export technology. These are large files to discuss. So yeah, we've got lots to do.
Well, thank you. I know that some of this kind of skims the surface, but I think it was particularly insightful. And thank you both for your participation and your insights and for answering some of the really fascinating questions that we got. So I will turn it over to CIC for some wrap up.
Thank you very much, dear panelists. Thank you very much, Dr. Greco, for your wonderful moderation. I hope every single attendee enjoyed this panel as much as I did, and we've learned a lot from you. Our next panel will be a keynote. The former Cabinet Minister, Chris Alexander, will be interviewed by the CIC's President, Ben Roswell. And that will begin at 12, and we hope to see some of you, at least, at that keynote as well. So thank you very much. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.